My wife left me for a 52-year-old man right after my accident, taking the children, and after 12 years she asks me for forgiveness and wants to come back. It was a crisp autumn morning when everything changed. I was driving to work, half distracted by thoughts of a presentation I had later that day, when a truck veered into my lane. I remember the deafening screech of brakes, the crunch of metal, and then, nothing. When I woke up 2 days later, the sterile white of a hospital room greeted me. I was told I had been in a coma. The doctors saved my life, but the price was devastating. My lower body was paralyzed. At 35, the man who jogged every morning, danced with his wife at weddings, and wrestled with his kids in the backyard was now confined to a wheelchair. Susan, my wife of 7 years, came to see me after the diagnosis. Her face was drawn and pale, but she said all the right things. "We'll get through this," she promised, holding my hand. Yet something in her tone felt hollow. I tried not to dwell on it. I needed her strength as I came to terms with my new reality. The first few weeks in the hospital were a haze of pain, despair, and therapy sessions. My kids, Laura and Lucas, were my only light. Susan brought them to see me 3 times a week. Their laughter and hugs gave me something to cling to. But even their visits became less frequent over time. I chalked it up to the strain this was putting on Susan, but the truth was far uglier. One afternoon, she arrived alone and handed me a folder. Inside were divorce papers. I stared at them, uncomprehending. "I can't do this," she said, her voice icy. "I'm still young, Jason. I deserve a normal life." She was gone before I could process her words. I sat there, paralyzed not just physically but emotionally, staring at the woman I loved as she walked away. Weeks later, friends told me they'd seen her dining with a man twice her age, wealthy, divorced, and childless. Some even whispered she had been seeing him before my accident. I was too numb to feel anger then, but the betrayal hit me like a second accident. I had lost my body, my wife, and my family in a matter of weeks. And the weight of it all was almost too much to bear. The days after Susan left were a blur of disbelief and heartbreak. I had been blindsided, left to pick up the pieces of a life that no longer felt like mine. When I was discharged from the hospital, I went back to an empty home. The children weren't there. Susan had taken them when she moved in with her new partner. I tried to visit. The first time, I knocked on the door of their grand suburban home, one far more lavish than the house Susan and I had shared. It took her a while to answer, and when she finally opened the door, she looked at me like I was a stranger. "The kids are busy," she said curtly, blocking the doorway. "They're adjusting to their new life." I begged her to let me see them. "They're my children too, Susan. They need me." "No, Jason," she snapped. "They need stability, and that's not something you can provide." She slammed the door, leaving me sitting there in my wheelchair on the pristine driveway, helpless and humiliated. I learned later that she had started feeding them lies. "Daddy left us because he couldn't handle being around us anymore," she told Laura and Lucas. "He's not the man he used to be." At first, I didn't believe she could poison them against me. But when I managed to reach Laura on the phone, her voice was cold, almost rehearsed. "Mom says you don't really want us. You just want to make her life hard." My heart broke into pieces I didn't know could exist. I had already lost my wife. Now it felt like I was losing my children too. Over the next year, I made every attempt I could to be part of their lives. I sent letters, gifts, and even tried to show up at their school events, but Susan always found a way to keep me away. Her new partner had the money and influence to make my life even harder. When I pressed too much, I was slapped with a restraining order under the guise of protecting the children's emotional well-being. I'll never forget the last time I tried to see them before I gave up for a while. It was Lucas's 6th birthday, and I'd scraped together enough money from odd jobs to buy him a remote-control car he'd wanted. I waited outside their house for hours, hoping to catch a glimpse of him. Finally, I saw him playing in the yard, and I called out, "Lucas!" His head turned, but before he could run to me, Susan stormed out, pulling him inside. I could hear her shouting at him to stay away from that man. That night, I cried for hours in my mother's arms. I was a father without children, a man without purpose. I was angry at Susan, angry at the world, but mostly, I was angry at myself for not being able to fight harder. But deep down, I knew this wasn't the end. I couldn't stay in that pit forever. I had to find a way to build something from the rubble she left behind. When I moved in with my mother, I felt like I had reached rock bottom. At 35 years old, I was living in my childhood home, unable to work, unable to walk, and utterly dependent on her. My mother, a 62-year-old widow, ran a small flower shop out of love more than profit. She was always kind and patient, but even I could see the strain of having to take care of me. "Jason," she said one day as she watered the plants in her modest greenhouse, "you've got two choices. You can let this break you, or you can build a new life, brick by brick. But you have to start somewhere." Her words stayed with me. I began helping her around the shop. At first, it was small things, organizing flowers, greeting customers, and sweeping the floors. Over time, I took on more responsibilities. I started handling phone orders, making deliveries when we found a driver, and even experimenting with bouquet arrangements. It gave me purpose, a reason to get out of bed every morning. The physical therapy sessions were grueling, but they became my battlefield. My therapist told me, "Progress isn't always linear, but it's progress." I clung to that. Every inch of regained mobility felt like a mile. First, I could sit up straight without help. Then I could move myself from the wheelchair to the bed on my own. And finally, after a year of intense effort, I managed to stand with the help of a walker. That moment felt like a rebirth. Small victories kept me going. I remember the day I drove for the first time in a modified vehicle. The freedom of the open road, even with hand controls, was exhilarating. Slowly, I was reclaiming pieces of my independence. The flower shop became more than a refuge, it became an opportunity. I started networking with event planners and began landing contracts for weddings and parties. What began as a small, local operation grew into something more. Within 3 years, I had hired a team and launched an event planning business, with floral arrangements as our centerpiece. My mother's shop was no longer just surviving, it was thriving. Through it all, my mother was my anchor. She never let me give up. On days when the pain of betrayal felt unbearable, she'd remind me, "The best revenge is living a good life." And so, I kept building. It started as an ordinary day in the shop. Amy came in to pick up flowers for a corporate event she was working on. She was polite and professional, asking about the arrangements and discussing delivery options. At the time, she was just another customer, but she came back. And again. Each visit brought a little more conversation. Sometimes it was about the flowers, other times about her work as an interior designer. She mentioned her 3-year-old daughter, Mia, and how she was learning to balance her busy career with raising a child. The way she talked about her life, with honesty and humor, left an impression on me. One afternoon, she lingered after finalizing her order. We talked about the flower shop's history, about my mother, and eventually about how life had thrown unexpected challenges at both of us. I felt at ease in her presence in a way I hadn't in years. One day, as we wrapped up the details of a wedding order, she asked, "Would you like to grab coffee sometime? Just to talk about ideas for the shop, or anything, really." It was unexpected, and for a moment, I didn't know what to say. "Yeah," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'd like that." That first coffee meeting turned into another, then another. We discovered common ground in our love for creativity and our shared determination to rebuild after setbacks. Slowly, something deeper grew between us. We didn't rush it. Both of us had pasts that had left us cautious. Trust came piece by piece, but it came. When Amy suggested expanding the shop into a full event planning business, it felt like the next natural step. Her knowledge and connections paired perfectly with my experience running the shop. Together, we launched what would become a successful venture. We worked side by side for 2 years before I decided to propose. It wasn't elaborate, just a quiet moment after a long day at work. I asked, and she said yes. Her daughter Mia, now 6, clapped her hands and exclaimed, "We're going to be a family!" Our wedding was small but perfect. My mother cried through the ceremony, and Mia stood proudly with us, holding her own little bouquet. That day felt like a fresh start. A new chapter filled with hope and possibility. Amy, Mia, my mother, and I built a life together. It wasn't always easy, but it was real, and it was ours. For the first time in years, I felt like I had a family again, a family that wanted me as much as I wanted them. As my business began to thrive and my life felt stable, I turned my attention to something I'd avoided for years: the injustice of the accident. For over a decade, the trucking company responsible had deflected accountability, pinning the blame on me and avoiding compensation. I'd been too financially strained to fight them back then, but now, with Amy's encouragement and the resources to hire a good lawyer, I decided to take a stand. The lawsuit was grueling. The trucking company's legal team fought hard, denying fault and dredging up every possible defense. Amy stood by me through every court hearing and sleepless night. My mother reminded me that I had already overcome worse, that this fight was just one more step toward reclaiming what was rightfully mine. While the case unfolded, another battle was brewing, one that was far more personal. For years, Susan had kept my children away from me. But now that my business was thriving and my life was stable, I was finally in a position to challenge her custody. I filed for joint custody, armed with evidence of my attempts to stay in my children's lives and the letters I'd written that had gone unanswered. When the day in court came, I was a nervous wreck. My lawyer argued passionately on my behalf, presenting the truth of my situation and Susan's deliberate efforts to alienate me. The judge asked if Laura and Lucas, now 17 and 15, wanted to weigh in. For the first time in years, I heard their voices, steady yet guarded. They said they wanted to see me but didn't know what to expect. It was clear they'd been fed years of misinformation. The judge granted me 15 days of visitation each month. It was a small victory, but to me, it was monumental. I had fought for my children and won a sliver of time to reconnect with them. It was the first real opportunity to bridge the gap that Susan had worked so hard to create. The next few months were a whirlwind. I met Laura and Lucas at the airport, nervous about their reactions. They were polite but distant, unsure of what to expect. Amy had prepared the guest room for them, making it as welcoming as possible. At first, the tension in the house was palpable. They were wary, holding back their emotions, as if waiting for me to prove myself. Susan's influence loomed large. She called them constantly, warning them against trusting me or Amy. It wasn't until one evening, after a family dinner, that everything came to a head. I sat them down and asked, "What has your mother told you about me?" Laura and Lucas exchanged uneasy glances before Laura spoke. "She said you left us. That you didn't want to be part of our lives." I felt my chest tighten. "That's not true," I said, my voice trembling. "I tried everything to see you. I wrote letters, sent gifts, even stood outside your house for hours hoping to catch a glimpse of you. But your mother blocked me at every turn." I showed them the court records, the restraining order, and copies of the letters I had sent over the years. Slowly, the truth began to sink in. Lucas, his voice barely above a whisper, admitted, "I wanted to contact you once, but Mom caught me. She said it would only hurt us more if we talked to you." Tears welled up in my eyes. "I never stopped loving you," I told them. "Not for a single day." We sat there, crying together, the years of distance and lies starting to crumble. Over the next few weeks, they began to open up. We went on a family vacation to Florida, and for the first time, I saw glimpses of the bond we'd once had. They laughed with Amy, played games with Mia, and even started calling my mother Grandma. The lawsuit against the trucking company also reached its conclusion around this time. The court ruled in my favor, awarding me compensation not just for the accident but also for the years of hardship caused by their negligence. It was a moment of vindication, proof that persistence and resilience could pay off, but nothing felt as important as reconnecting with my children. It wasn't just about winning custody. It was about healing wounds that had festered for too long. A few months after my initial visits with Laura and Lucas, something I hadn't anticipated happened. Susan showed up at my office unannounced. She looked different, worn, nervous. For a moment, I wondered if this was the same woman who had walked out on me so easily all those years ago. "Jason," she said, her voice softer than I remembered. "Can we talk?" I didn't invite her to sit down. "What do you want, Susan?" She hesitated, wringing her hands. "I made mistakes," she began. "I didn't handle things well after your accident. I was scared, overwhelmed. You abandoned me." I interrupted, my voice calm but firm. "You took my children, lied to them, and kept me from seeing them for years. You didn't just make mistakes, Susan. You destroyed our family." Her face crumpled, but I couldn't tell if it was genuine regret or an act. "I didn't know what else to do," she said. "I thought I was doing what was best for the kids. And I was desperate." I crossed my arms, leaning back in my chair. "And now? What's changed?" Her shoulders sagged as she confessed. "Things with him haven't been great. He's grown distant, and he's threatened to cut me off. The kids have been pulling away from me ever since they started spending time with you. I feel like I've lost them. You have, I said bluntly. You lost them the moment you decided they were a tool to use against me. She flinched, but I wasn't done. I have a new life now, Susan. A wife who loves me. A family that supports me. I don't need you coming back to disrupt it. Her expression shifted, her voice growing desperate. But we're your real family, Jason. Me, Laura, and Lucas, we belong together. That was the final straw. I stood, gripping the edge of my desk. Laura and Lucas are my children, and I'll always love them. But you? You stopped being my family the moment you walked out that door and left me for someone else. Don't you dare try to rewrite history now. Her tone turned sharp, almost venomous. You think this life you've built with that woman? She spat the word like it was poison. And her child is real? Mia isn't even yours. And yet she's more of a daughter to me than you've allowed Lucas and Laura to be for over a decade. I replied coolly. Family isn't about blood, Susan. It's about love, trust, and loyalty. You threw all of that away. Susan's composure shattered. She made a scene, shouting about how she had sacrificed for the children and how I was manipulating them against her. It wasn't until I threatened to call security that she finally left. When I got home that evening, I told Amy everything. She listened without judgment, her calm demeanor grounding me. My mother chimed in as well, saying what I already knew in my heart. She doesn't care about you, Jason. She cares about the life she thinks you can give her now. When Laura and Lucas found out about Susan's visit, they were furious. She's always twisting things, Laura said. We don't want to go back to that house. We want to live here. The transition wasn't immediate, but by the end of the year, Laura and Lucas moved in with us full-time. They were ready for a fresh start, and I was ready to give them the stable, loving home they deserved. Meanwhile, my life with Amy, Mia, and now Laura and Lucas was everything I could have hoped for. We weren't perfect, but we were happy. Every Sunday, we gathered for family dinners. My mother, Amy, Mia, Laura, and Lucas, and it felt like the home I had always wanted to build. Susan's attempts to reconcile faded over time, though she occasionally sent angry messages or tried to stir up trouble. I ignored them. My focus was on the family I had now and the life I was determined to protect. 12 years ago, I thought my life was over. The accident took my mobility, my wife, and my sense of purpose. I had lost everything that mattered to me, and the idea of starting over seemed impossible. But life has a way of surprising you when you least expect it. Today, I wake up every morning surrounded by love and purpose. My wife, Amy, is my partner in every sense of the word, someone who stood beside me as we built a thriving business and a beautiful life together. Mia, her daughter, feels as much mine as my own blood. She calls me Dad now, and every time she does, it reminds me that family is something you create, not something you're simply given. Laura and Lucas have come to call this place home. It hasn't been without its challenges. Teenagers bring their own storms, but we've weathered them together. We've laughed, cried, argued, and forgiven, and through it all, they've become part of this new chapter in my life. They've also started seeing Susan for who she really is, and while that truth has been painful for them, it's also allowed them to start healing. Every Sunday, we sit down for dinner as a family. My mother, who has been my greatest source of strength, is always there, teasing me about how I used to mess up her bouquets back in the flower shop. These dinners are loud and chaotic, with stories, laughter, and the occasional squabble. But they are also my favorite moments, proof that even after devastation, you can rebuild. As for Susan, her attempts to intrude on our lives have dwindled. Her old partner left her, and from what I hear, she's struggling to hold on to the life she sacrificed everything to chase. I don't hate her anymore. If anything, I pity her. But I've learned that forgiveness doesn't mean opening the door to someone who has proven they'll hurt you again. She made her choices, and I've made mine. I often think back to that day in the hospital when the doctors told me I might never walk again, when Susan handed me those divorce papers, and when I thought I had lost everything. If I could go back and tell that version of myself anything, I'd say this: hold on. There's life after heartbreak. There's love after betrayal. And there's purpose after loss. The family I have now isn't the one I thought I'd have, but it's the one I cherish with all my heart. Laura and Lucas live with us full-time but are starting to explore their independence as young adults. Mia keeps us all on our toes, and Amy remains my rock. We still face challenges. Life is never without them, but we faced them together. 12 years ago, I thought my story was over. Now, I know it was only just beginning.